how delightful that you're joining the panel of Australians for Constitutional Monarchy in our 25th National Conference, the Sydney phase of that National Conference, and it being the 25th anniversary of the referendum which decided that Australia should continue as a constitutional monarchy. It's interesting to note that the first serious move to change Australia into a republic, meaning ending the monarchy, the crown, was not at federation. It was in 1981. It wasn't a heroic circumstance, as you would expect with the Declaration of Independence, Declaration of the Rights of Man, Magna Carta. It was nothing like that. Thomas Keneally writes about it in one of his books. He was the first chairman of the Australian Republican movement. And he said this: the lunch at Jill Hickson's and Neville Wran's. To the young people, Neville Wran was a Labor Premier of New South Wales. The lunch at Jill Hickson's and Neville Wran's had reached the point where nearly all the fish that had been bought the day before at the Sydney fish markets had been eaten, in a manner all too typical of generous Sunday lunches in Sydney. A number of bottles of Hunter River Chardonnay had been drained. Neville Wran leaned across the table and said, "The other thing I want to see before I bloody well die is an Australian republic." Well, that was the beginning of what we're celebrating tonight. And how delightful to have with us the people who are on the panel, because they were people who were involved at the time. And also in the room, there's Lloyd Waddy, who was the first national convener. Justice Lloyd Waddy, Sophie Mirabella, Jerry Wheeler in the Prime Minister's office, John Ruddock, who was young convener of Australians for National Monarchy, and also John Armfield, Stephen Copeman and the Copeman family, all people around and at the time, and many others. This is an historic occasion, because from 1991, the decade from 1991 to 1999, we tested whether Australians wanted to become a republic, and that was rejected. Who would have thought, I don't think many of us would have thought of this, that this would continue for another 25 years. So you had a decade, and then you had a quarter of a century before the matter was finally resolved. Now, anyone with a minimal understanding of Australian history would know that the Australian Constitution was written in conventions, elected by the Australian people, and approved in referendums in the states, the self-governing colonies, by the Australian people. It's extraordinary then that the father of the Australian Republic, or the man who hoped to be the father of the Australian Republic, Mr. Paul Keating, on more than one occasion claimed that our Constitution was imposed on Australia by the British Foreign Office. Extraordinary that it wasn't the Colonial Office, but he said it was the British Foreign Office. Absolutely something completely untrue. And how extraordinary that once this was launched, and once it was said that this republic was inevitable, the media jumped onto the bandwagon. And how extraordinary, too, that the republic emerged as a wedge in the Liberal Party, which Alexander Downer as the leader, and then John Howard had to handle. Well, my first question then is to John Howard, the 25th Prime Minister of Australia. John, you not only had to oppose the Keating, was to become the Keating-Turnbull Republic, you had to neutralise the wedge that was emerging in the Liberal Party. How did you handle that?
Well, I think I probably handled it as you should always handle those things, and that is let, in a broad church, let democracy flourish. What do you mean?
Just going to swap microphones.
The round head.
Hello. Test.
Well,
No?
I thought you were a monarch.
I thought I was as well.
You give me this dud equipment.
Hello.
Is that better? Yeah. I thought the only way to approach it, and bear in mind that we have a tradition in the Liberal Party that on difficult issues, and this is a difficult issue, you allow a free vote, not a conscience vote. That's a misnomer. It's a free vote. And I would say that 70 to 80% of the federal parliamentary Liberal Party in 1999 were monarchists and the rest were Republicans. In the leadership group of the coalition, which comprised myself as Prime Minister, then Tim Fisher as Deputy Prime Minister, Peter Costello as Deputy Liberal Leader and Treasurer, and John Anderson as Deputy Leader of the National Party. And I, for reasons of his sort of political weight and so forth, I also throw in Robert Hill, the Leader of the government in the Senate. Of those six, three of them, myself, Anderson and Vale were monarchists, the other three, Alston, Hill and Costello, were Republican. Now, we openly discussed this, and it was agreed that there would be a free vote, but people would exercise civility and decency in the public debate, and I'm very happy to say we all did. I sometimes, God rest his soul because he's no longer with us, wondered what Tim Fisher's real position was. It seemed to change a bit during the debate. But others were, I mean, Peter Costello and I had a respectful disagreement on it, and there it was. But in the end, the good people won and the bad people lost. And I think it was best epitomised by that wonderful night in the Millennium Stadium in Wales, when our late Queen was there not to receive the results of the referendum, but rather to hand the William Webb Ellis Trophy to the victorious Wallabies who defeated the dreaded French. Talk about, all your prayers coming together at once. And I remember, and he's openly talked about this, as the Queen went along the row of Australian players. She knew the results and she was very happy, I'm told, because it was followed very closely, as you can understand. And when she came to Timmy Horan, who was a wonderful centre, three-quarter from Queensland, I think he'd gone to Downland College in Toowoomba. And he said in a very loud voice, "I voted for you, Your Majesty." And nobody was there to argue with Timmy. No Australian, even the devoutest Republican, wasn't going to argue with him. But it was a wonderful night. I had my doots, as the Scots say, at the beginning, because the monarchy had been through a pretty rough period. They even tried to burn Windsor Castle at one stage. That was the dreaded Republicans, I'm sure, tried to do that. But we allowed a free vote. And the other thing, while I've got this microphone, one of the really ridiculous stories that went around after the Republic went down in screaming heap, because, it was all Howard's fault, he manipulated the question. He did not. The question was what I said we would present. I said, and I give full marks to Alexander Downer. He was terrific on this. He said, we'll have a referendum. Now, first of all, we'll have a constitutional convention. And if a consensus emerges from that convention around a particular model for a republic and there's support for it, we'll put it to the people. And when I became the leader, I faithfully committed myself to what Alexander Downer had said. And there was a bit of to and fro and give and take at the convention and a bit of squabbling, largely amongst the Republicans. And they finally came forward with the model that was put, which was largely what I've just described. It was put forward by the Labor Party and those Liberals who supported a republic, and it was that you have a Governor-General or have a President appointed by a large majority of the two houses of Parliament, and that's that. Now, that's essentially what emerged, and that's essentially what was put. This idea that that was a manipulation, my part. Now, of course there is differences of opinion about what model you have for a republic, if you're going to have one. There are people who think you should have a directly elected president. I have three older brothers, two of them sadly are no longer with me. The third one is 2 or 3 years older than I, as many of you know, is a member of the Labor Party, but it doesn't alter the fact that we're very fond of each other and we have a very good relationship. And Bob said to me after the referendum was defeated, he said, if there's ever another one, and I noticed he said ever, another one, he said, I'll be on your side if they want a directly elected president. Now, of course, that symbolises the difficulty that republicanism has. I was talking a few days ago to an Irishman, a well-informed Irishman, and he said to me, he said, did you ever meet Mary Robinson? I said, yes, it's hard not to forget meeting Mary Robinson. She could talk under wet cement. But, and she was the president of Ireland, the directly elected president of Ireland, and the only precedent for a Republican form of government that involves a directly elected president that has been put to me is Ireland. Hardly surprising, given the very close historical links between our country and the Irish people. And this fellow said, when she was President of Ireland, she constantly told the Taoiseach, that's the Prime Minister, that, of course, she couldn't agree with what the government was doing because she had a direct mandate from the Irish people, that her mandate was even more direct and better than hers. Well, that's an unworkable state of affairs. Now, I'm sure only the Irish could work to that position, and God bless them, they're wonderful people. And this country owes an enormous amount to its Irish heritage. But the final demonstration of the utility of our system of government is what we've seen across the water in the United States. People said to me, what did you think of Trump's victory? I said, I wouldn't have voted for either of them. I say that as somebody who respects a number of very good things I thought President Trump did, the Abraham Accords and his handling of the economy, but I find it very hard to get over the fact that he tried to overturn the democratic will of the American people. But the point is that they have a system of government there where the leader, the standard bearer, is chosen in a completely different way than we choose our standard bearers. There's no way, in my view, that either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris would have become the leaders in that ballot under a parliamentary system. Now, that's just my view, and I respect the fact there's probably a lot of people in this room are a lot happier than I am. I'm not unhappy. I think she'd have been a terrible president. But anyway, I haven't come here tonight to make a political speech. But I have come here tonight, though, to make the point that we have a superior system of government.
Hear, hear.
And if I have a request, a plea, an entreaty to all of you who believe in the constitutional monarchy, keep in mind that the rational defence of the utility of the system is our best argument. There'll always be fluctuations in the popularity of the individual monarch. I couldn't recall many during the reign of the late Queen Elizabeth II. She became Queen when I commenced my first year at Canterbury Boys High School in 1952. It just seems an age away. We did, however, hold the ashes, so it's not all that distant. But I think it's very important to remember just how stable this country is and just how easily we can handle issues, because in the end, they're remitted not to the courts but to the Australian people. We had a tumultuous series of months in 1975, whatever your politics are. Most of us, I guess, were pretty happy with the ultimate outcome. But the ultimate outcome was resolved by the Australian people. They voted, and that fixed it in the end. Now, you can drizzle as much as you like, but in the end, if the people finally decide something, then it's bound to be something that's going to last. So that's a long way away from the question. I just want to mention two other people who aren't here tonight who I think helped bring about as I described to my daughter tonight as she looked at me, she said, I haven't seen a lot of those before, Dad. And she said, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the rout of the Roundheads. And fortunately, she'd studied her history fairly closely and she knew what that was all about. I want to pay tribute to Michael Kirby. Michael Kirby and I were roughly at university at pretty much the same time as David. Now, Michael and I would disagree on a lot of things politically. I think he's slightly to the left of me on most political issues. But on this issue, he was an eloquent and consistent defender of the common sense status quo. And I thought he should be remembered and respected for that. And could I also pay tribute to somebody who's no longer with us, who years ago was something of a sparring partner of mine in Parliament, and that's the late Bill Hayden. Bill Hayden was a man who was very much a monarchist, very much a Republican. And I can recall when, I don't mind it, disclosing this, when there was some debate about whether he might become the Governor-General. And I was then the opposition leader and doing pretty poorly, I've got to say, first time around. And I went to see Bob Hawke and said, Prime Minister, what's all this stuff about Hayden? He said, oh, well, Hayden's a good bloke, you know that, John. I said, yes, he's a good bloke, but he doesn't, he's a Republican. And Bob's sort of responsible, so what, you know, and very disarming response, I've got to tell you. And, but he, of course, maybe it's the ennobling effect of the office, that he was the model of propriety and impeccability. Even some people thought he'd become a monarchist by the time he retired as Governor-General. And I liked Bill Hayden. He was a real battler in the best sense of the word, who hadn't had life all that easy. Quite a bit of personal family tragedy, but he battled on, and to have the possibility of becoming Prime Minister snatched away from you at the last minute by a party eager to consolidate its clear political advantage would have been tough. But he was somebody who in the end understood the great balancing effect. And who are the real villains? Well, the villains aren't the genuine Republicans. The villains are those people who sort of, they're Republicans at heart, but they want the trappings of monarchical office. They want the baubles. They want all of that. I think most Australians, with their deep sort of cynicism, find that a bit hard to take. But I just want to say to you, as somebody who deep down felt very strongly about this issue, but wanted as best I could to hold my party together. And I was able to do that because most of us wanted to see the Roundheads off. They did. We did, really. But others didn't, and they were very senior people, very decent people, huge contributors. And we managed it as best we could, but in the end, the common sense of the Australian people triumphed. I don't think we'll have a referendum on this issue. It is a very bold prediction, and I may not be around to be accountable for it in my lifetime. And I turned 85 last July, so that's my prediction. But the people to whom the greatest gratitude is owed are those in this room. So I look around, and you are the guts of the opposition. All walks of life, a cross-section of the Australian community, and you saw off this blatant attempt to take from us an inheritance bequeathed by circumstance, history, and the magnificent example of service that the late lady whose beautiful portrait adorns the wall opposite me, I thought she gave. Neville Wran did say what you said, he said, but he added on, but you've got to be careful. The Queen is bloody popular and you will find it very hard to win.
Thank you, Prime Minister. John, I did invite Michael Kirby this evening. He couldn't come because he was going to give some speech at some peculiar organisation which I didn't quite understand, something to do with psychiatry, but I've forgotten what it was. But Michael is always speaking to peculiar functions. He was very good. He was important. When the Australian Republican movement was formed, I thought, who should I speak to? And I thought, I should speak to the president of the Liberal Party because the Labor Party is now locked in. The Labor Party, under their platform, is committed to a republic, although, as I always say, some of the greatest leaders of the Australian Labor Party were constitutional monarchists. So I contacted the president of the Liberal Party in New South Wales, and although I'm a nobody, he answered his phone and spoke to me. That was Peter King. Unfortunately, obviously hasn't been able to come along tonight. He was going to be here. And Peter talked to me about this, and I said, really, what you've got to do is establish something associated, something coming from the Liberal Party, but it has to be such that people like Michael Kirby and Doug Sutherland, who was the former Lord Mayor, the Labor Lord Mayor of Sydney, Patricia's here tonight, you've got to have people like that who are joining Australia's constitutional monarchy, because you've got to spread the vote across from just the Liberal Party. So he certainly involved Michael Kirby. Michael Kirby would have come tonight. He sends his best wishes and hopes I'm not too excessively conservative. The other person you mentioned, John, is Bill Hayden, a wonderful man. Bill Hayden at the Constitutional Convention produced a model for direct election. There were 4 models at the Constitutional Convention. This was the only real direct election model. And he said, I'm only doing this because I've been asked to produce a model. I think, he said, he referred to John Howard, he said, I told the Prime Minister that I think the best system is what we have now. But since you need a model, this is the next best model, and it's direct election. So he offered a model for direct election. And one of the silver bullets that the Australian Republican movement goes on with, they have these silver bullets which they think will suddenly drop a republic into their lap. One was the passing of the Queen, and of course that bounced back in their faces because the present system under the King has proved even more popular than it was at the time of the referendum. But Bill Hayden came up with a model, he presented that model, and that was appropriate. He didn't get many votes for it. One of the silver bullets that the Republicans have is if we produce a model with popular election, that'll sway everything. It'll completely trash the monarchists and we'll win. Well, that's not true, because if you trace the voting numbers, the proportions that each model attracted, you look at each model at the Constitutional Convention, then you look at the percentage of the votes of those who were pushing it. The direct elect model only got about 3% of the vote to the Constitutional Convention. I don't think that's the silver bullet that they think it is. But there's one thing that I think we should now hear, and it relates to what happened on that occasion, and I'll just get it up as soon as, here we are. Funny when your thing doesn't work, isn't it? And it's from Jason Morrison, who sent me this today. And I'll get it up again. It's not coming up. We'll do it later then, and I'll go on to the next matter. And that is, an extraordinary thing happened after the Republic was announced. And that was, there was an extraordinary amount of support for a Republic in the print media. I'm going to ask Alan Jones about this because he's from the media. A leading editor came out from England and he said he found it extraordinary the degree to which the Australian media supported turning Australia into a republic, how they were almost unanimous in this, and how they pushed this and used every device for it. There was one exception to that, and that was Alan Jones. Alan Jones stood out completely. Alan, I want you to tell us why you thought the other pieces of the media all went for a republic, but you always ended those calls that came to you when people said to you, Alan, I don't know what to do. You would always say, if you don't know, vote no. Alan.
Well, thank you, David. Look, from first principles, I have always taken the view that this was a completely elitist proposition. For example, one of the proposals that was recommended about all of this was that a republic should be formed and the president should be appointed by the parliament. Now, one of the things that's emerged politically, whatever you might think of Donald Trump, one thing is clear from the American election, and that is that the legacy media and celebrities have no cut through whatsoever with the ordinary person out there. And so, that's the lesson, and that's the case here. The notion, and this is not the only issue which was to be resolved. I did say to Prime Minister Howard earlier tonight that having won the referendum, I said, well, look, to be honest with you, we didn't have much opposition because, in a sense, these people couldn't define what they wanted. It's ideologically driven, and the notion that Parliament itself will determine, and all you rabble out there aren't smart enough and you don't know enough to have an opinion about any of this, and anyway, if we gave you a viewpoint, you'd get it wrong. I remember Malcolm Turnbull ringing me on the issue of same-sex marriage, and he said, oh, you've got to talk to, and Tony was the Prime, you've got to talk to Tony about all of this. He said, he's talking about a plebiscite. He said, it's got to be determined by the Parliament. You can't have the public involved in all of this. It'll be terribly divisive. I said, oh, Malcolm, if you've got a problem, go and argue with Tony. Don't bring your problems to me. But at the end of the day, it was the same principle. Don't let the public have a say. They're too stupid. They don't know anything about it. And that was fundamentally an issue here. And at the end of the day, one of the things that's emerged politically on any issue is that once you start getting the Oprah Winfreys and the Taylor Swifts and all these sorts of people and put your arm around them and believe that they know exactly what is the best in the best interest of either America or here, you know that you're on a winner. Because the key element in all of this, when I said to people, you know, the case was never put. If you then decided you had a president, even if the president was elected by the Parliament, Malcolm Turnbull rang my program one morning at about 7:25. I was on air and the staff answered the phone. And when the break came for the news at 7:30, Paul Christians came and said to me, oh, Malcolm Turnbull's just rung in a rage, having heard what you editorialised about the referendum. And he wanted to come on the program. Well, yeah, okay. Well, I told him we didn't have time. No, cancel everything after 7:30, get him up. So got Malcolm up. Well, of course, I said to him now, he was raging. And I said, well, firstly, can you tell us out there, because, you know, we're all pretty simple and stupid, what would be the powers of the president? Sorry, Malcolm, you're there? You there? What would be the powers of the president? What would be the powers of the Prime Minister? Well, he was a shot duck. So in other words, he had this, you know, verbiage, or what they called about Kamala Harris, what is it, a word salad. So he had this word salad about the Republic, but they couldn't define for the ordinary person to understand exactly what would be the function of the President and what would be the function of the Prime Minister. And Prime Minister Howard made that point earlier tonight about Mary Robinson. And it's exactly the story that I have heard about the Taoiseach was being argued with by the President, because she said, well, I had greater power, I was popularly elected by the people of Ireland. And we can't afford that kind of breakdown of a system of government which has worked perfectly well for us. In other words, you've got to ask the ordinary bloke out there, how do you feel when you wake up in the morning? Is there this burning urge to have a republic as opposed to a monarchy? Do you shave in the mirror and say, oh, God, it wouldn't hurt us much if we were a republic, but because it's a monarchy, I really feel disenchanted about facing the day? I mean, it's just rubbish. People are fundamentally happy with what we've got. There is enough division in the society at that time, and there is now, rather than promoting further division via a system of government which those people proposing it don't know anything about and can't define it. Can't define the functions, don't know how to operate. And that's why I then said, well, listen, you don't know, I don't know. We'll all vote no. Unfortunately, you know, at that stage, I had a program went halfway across Australia, and particularly in the bush, you know, the bush people, they're so lovely and they're so simple and straightforward, and they just said, look, this is a heap of crap, right, all of this, you know. But it was elitist. And the modern message, even today, there's still an elite element out there, and this is where conservative forces have got to come to grips with it. You know, those celebrities don't speak for the ordinary person. And the mainstream media, lefties who editorialise and they know, and they pompously pontificate about what's good for Australia. I can remember Prime Minister Howard, now one of the most successful, second most successful Prime Minister in Australia's history, when the Bulletin magazine, this is a classic case, Bulletin magazine, I remember one day, and the headline had John Howard on the front of it, and it said, why does he bother? Why does he bother, Mr. sort of 17% or Mr. 18? Why does he bother? Hey, how many elections did he win? Because he could relate to the ordinary bloke. There was no elitism about John Howard. And that's the central component of this debate. It is an elitist debate. It's a debate prefaced and predicated on the notion that an elite few people know better than the ordinary Australian. And while ever the ordinary Australian is given a vote in any of this, he will vote emphatically no. He's perfectly happy with the system we've got today. They've loved that woman up there, and they actually like the way Charles is operating. And see them line up here? Oh, Albo and all these people. I'll get into trouble for saying this, but bugger it, I'm going to say it. How on earth can you have an avowed Republican woman becoming the Governor-General? It staggers me, not that she'd be offered the gig, but that she'd accept the gig. And why? Because they have lovely toys, it's a nice home, the servants, 300 acres down there in 130 acres down there in Canberra. This is a nonsense. See, they all line up. The first people in the queue to shake Her Majesty's or His Majesty's hand, there they are. Diana came out here. I had to speak at the gig for Diana. And there they were. Neville was up there praising the princess, and she was as bored, rigid as you can imagine, listening to all these people, knowing that they really were interested in getting rid of her. So we stick to our guns. David, you've done a wonderful job. The two Davids here, Prime Minister Howard, Tony, who's not here, Tony Abbott, Michael Kirby, and Bill Hayden, a wonderful man. I'm glad you said that, John, about Bill Hayden, wonderful man. And there are so many good people who came on board then. But at the end of the day, if you start alienating the punter doesn't like it, and the punter will rise against it, and the punters said no.
Another question to John Howard. When you got the convention finally together and there was an election and the nominated people were appointed, the idea was that the convention would consider a model, they considered 4, they would consider a model and come to a consensus. That was the term used. Well, the convention came to a conclusion, but it wasn't a 51% majority, probably because all of the constitutional monarchists would vote no against any model, because that was our brief from the people who elected us. So consequently, you got a model coming from the convention, which some of us call the Keating-Turnbull model, but it didn't enjoy a 51% majority. John, you went to close the convention and you spoke to the convention, and as a result, you became the toast of the Republicans. What did you do and why did you do that?
Well, I did it because I did not want... I knew in the end, in my heart, that there had to be a vote on the issue and that you would only put it to bed in the right way, which was to defeat a republic, if you had a vote. And when I said that I thought there was enough support at the convention to go to a referendum behind or voting on a model that was largely by default, in some respects, the most popular model to come out of the convention, I still haven't forgotten the look of sheer elation on the faces of Janet Holmes of Court and Neville Wran, who were two celebrities, but significant celebrities on the other side of the argument. And I was, for a period of time, probably until voting day, fairly popular with the Republicans because I'd given them a vote. And in the end, you can't beat a majority verdict of the Australian people. And in the end, you've always got to respect it. And it's long been my belief that there is a very deep deposit of Celtic scepticism in the Australian community. We are a Celtic country as much, even if not more, than we are an English country. The Irish and Scottish influence, and Australians are to wake up when they're being asked to vote for something. They say, what's he want? What's really behind this? I don't like it. And I think unless you gave the Australian people a vote on this issue, and they did have a fair vote, and they had the support, as Alan knows, heavens above, the ABC, that's usual, the Fairfax media, and News Corporation was absolutely missionary in support. And I can, I remember the attitude of many of the principal figures in News Corporation. And that's how it was. Alan, I've written in my memoirs, Alan and to a lesser extent Neil Mitchell, Alan was the sole media. Well, I remember him saying to Alan, I hope this doesn't embarrass me to say it, but 2 months out from the election, I said to the vote, I said, Alan, how do you think it'll go? He said, it's going to go down in a heap. And he said, and I haven't started yet. I was quite buoyed by that comment. And because there's nobody better to have on your side than Alan Belford-Jones when there's a very big fight on.
Thank you.
Look, I just in the end came to the conclusion we had to have a vote. And if you were trying to put it off, you'd look tricky. People would think you're running away from defeat. And in the end, if the Australian people had wanted a republic, they'd have voted for it. But they voted, roughly 55-45 against. There was not one jurisdiction other than the ACT. As Fred Daly famously said, looks like Kalara and votes like Cessnock. And the mob voted against it. I think if you had a referendum tomorrow, which you won't, I can assure you of that, and I don't hold any political power or office anymore, it'd go down in an even bigger heap, particularly after people have seen the example of the... And also there was a bit of a feeling behind the Hawke idea. Hawke kept saying to me, I've told my mob that what they ought to do is pass a law saying we'll have a referendum on the Republic when the Queen dies. And I said, I don't know that people will sort of want to vote for something that's contingent on the Queen's death. She's very popular. I mean, he liked the Queen. I think they had a common sporting interest, I seem to recall. But he was very respectful towards her, let me may say, very, very. But I just think in the end you can't run away from having a vote on something. And just as the vindication of John Kerr was in the 1975 and 1977 election results, the resolution of this issue, at least in the lifetime, let me dare to say, of many in this room, myself included, was in the referendum that was held. It was a clear result. The mob said no, and we're all much happier as a result.
I think I should point out that compared with the recent shenanigans over how to hold a referendum, John Howard's running of the referendum, the Republic referendum, was impeccable. There was no humming and hawing about the yes-no booklet. John introduced an innovation, that is equal funding. Yeah. This was an innovation, had never happened before, and it was equal funding, and it was done absolutely fairly, and no one could complain about the way in which that referendum was run. I think it's worth mentioning that. Now a question to David Elliott. David, you were appointed to become the National Campaign Director of ACM, and your task was to set up a machine similar to the Australian Republican movement, but better, with a central command, which would operate every day during the referendum campaign, with directors in every state, with a coordinator in every electorate. How did it work? And how did it work in comparison to the Republican alternative?
Well, thanks, David. It's always hard to follow Mr. Howard and Mr. Jones, but I'll do my best. It was certainly a new experience for the Conservative side of politics, because we'd always relied on the Liberal Party as our infrastructure. And I remember the day that I started with ACM, with you and Kerry and in the national office, and I rang the Federal Secretary of the Liberal Party and was promptly told that it was a conscience vote, and so the party would not be taking any role, which put me in direct odds with the Labor Party, who of course were officially supporting the yes case. So we had to go into a recruiting phase, and we used most of our political contacts and media contacts to find state campaign managers in all of the states and territories. And in Queensland, we found a fantastic Vietnam veteran named Jeff Jones, and he did a great job there. In New South Wales, I was based here, but we also appointed a coordinator. In Victoria, we got a great old DLP coordinator who had been recommended to me by Tony Abbott, and in Tasmania, there was a president of the Young Liberals. South Australia, we got somebody who Nick Minchin recommended. In WA, we got somebody who I think had been recommended by one of the former Western Australian premiers. So we immediately got, within about a month, our state campaign managers and coordinators. And then I said to them, right, we're going to break now down to campaign managers per federal electorate. And so it was the responsibility of both the state campaign manager and myself to go to every single federal electorate. And of course, in New South Wales, I had 50 to find. But we did find them. Rachel was one of them in Parramatta, and we went right around the National Party and the Liberal Party and a couple of the other minor Conservative parties. We spoke to the RSL. We spoke to some of the other organisations that had given an indication of support in the preceding 7 or 8 years before the referendum was called. And then, of course, they were targeted and told that they would have to run the local media campaign. And one thing that we did very, very, very well was communications. And it was great that we were not only getting people like Stephanie ringing Alan Jones in the morning talking about it, but we had, the local coordinators in the local electorates writing to the local paper, and when the campaign was coming to to Dubbo or to Townsville or to Launceston, they were responsible for making sure that we had publicity. It was tough because some of these people, particularly ones that were north of retirement age, they'd never been in politics before, and they weren't used to being criticised in the media, and they weren't used to being receiving that sort of. And let me tell you, I mean, I've loved politics because I love the brawling. I'm from Bankstown. We're not happy unless we're fighting. But seeing some of these people who had thought that they were campaigning on an honourable cause against honourable people and getting absolutely trashed, it was hard. And so one of the seven doctrines of military service is morale. You've got to keep your morale up. You've got to keep your people happy and content, and you've got to keep them confident that they're doing the right thing. And that was very, very tough. And I remember I made some disparaging remarks in one of the campaign debates about some Republicans, and the union movement and the Labor Party and the ABC said that I was a dreadful person because, I was so nasty. And I thought, you know what, you people have got a glass jaw, And I think that was a bit of where it turned. I think particularly for our rank and file for our base, where it turned was when Turnbull turned up to State Parliament for a Senate inquiry, which was being held in the New South Wales State Parliament, and he said, and I quote, "We don't want the terms president or republic used in the referendum," and they all went to pastry, because we were able to highlight the fact that they knew that this was tricky, and I think where there was a real injection of morale in our campaign at a grassroots level right then and there was because our people were able to say we've got the moral high ground now.
Earlier there'd been a major event before you came on, and that was in 1996. There seemed to be a competition among Labor leaders to be the father of the Republic. And I got the impression that Bob Carr, the Premier of New South Wales, was irritated that Keating was going to become the father of the Republic. So Bob Carr devised this extraordinary plan to throw the governor out of Government House. And Kerry Jones and Lloyd decided that you couldn't have a situation where the governor was thrown out of the place which was built specifically for his purposes, which if you didn't have, you couldn't appoint anybody from Sydney as governor because they couldn't live in the city. And they organised a demonstration. It was the only real demonstration in the Republic-monarchy debate. And I think it tells you something about the passion and interest of people, because about 20 to 30,000 people in the most peaceful demonstration in Macquarie Street assembled to protest against that. It took to 2011 to get a government to return the governor to Government House. But Alan, doesn't that tell us something about the importance that Australians put on the existing system compared with the absence of passion by the Republicans whenever they held a function?
I think, David, the deep respect that Australians have, unstated and often unspoken, for our institutional structures. And they saw something like Government House as a symbol of an institutional structure that had served us well, and they recognised that this overt attack on not just the monarchy but an individual and a person. I mean, I knew Nick Shahady and his wife very well, and Mari Bashir was appointed, a very distinguished Australian and a countrywoman. She was appointed the governor. And I remember Mari telling me that she went to, as governor, when she got home at whatever hour at night, she went to Woolworths to shop. She'd often have to change 2 or 3 times a day, so she'd step out of the dress she was in and it'd be left on the floor. She'd get another one on and she'd come back for the night, she had another one on, and tomorrow morning she had to sort of clean all this up and fix up her own wardrobe. I mean, this was absolutely absurd, the way in which she was treated, and it lacked dignity and it lacked respect. And eventually, you know, the state woke up to all of this and government woke up to it, but it was a symbol of how the whole Republican movement would stop at nothing to get their way. And that was just one manifestation of that. And it angered rank and file people who haven't got time. I mean, you write 20 or 30,000, I was there protesting, but there were hundreds of thousands who'd like to be there but can't be there. So in so many ways, there's a fundamental respect within the Australian community amongst ordinary people, and we're all ordinary. We're all ordinary. John Howard's ordinary. He's just given extraordinary responsibilities. But he sees himself as an ordinary person like everyone here. Different people have extraordinary tasks delivered to them. And the ordinary Australian says, this doesn't make sense to me. I'm perfectly happy where I am, and I won't cop a bar of it. And you know, there's an elitism about Malcolm, of course, in all that he's done, and we've seen that on so many issues in terms of his own behaviour, and he was really the biggest handbrake that they had in the whole operation, and he conducted himself. And when he gets into strife, of course, he gets personal and angry and whatever, and that didn't wash. So it was, and Prime Minister Howard's right. There'll never be another one of these. No one will have the stupidity to propose the same thing to the Australian electorate.
Thank you. Now, as a memory of the night, Jason Morrison will present something to us. Just put it in here.
Good evening. Hi. Back then, I was a kid. I was 6 years old. I worked at a radio station, 2GB, which back then more people listened to Taxis combined than listened to 2GB because Alan Jones and John Laws were on 2UE. Our breakfast announcer was Richo, Graham Richardson, who I'll give you a guess which side he was on. So the situation was 2GB, it was the Republic station that no one listened to anyway, and the ABC and everyone else. I was a reporter, young reporter, and I was put in charge of the coverage on the night because, being the media, nobody wanted to cover the Republic thing because they didn't want to be associated with it because, you know, they thought it was all in winter. They were going out to celebrate. So my job was to sit in the National Tally Room and report. And I found this tape the other day and I sent it to David because I thought it's a great piece of history. My mother kept it because she was not just proud of me, but she was proud of the day. And you've got it. Have you got it there? I've got it here. I want to play it to you. It's just a few minutes. This is what happened on the night. And, I mean, you people made this happen.
Network and associated stations around Australia. This is Jason Morrison reporting from the National Tally Room. And the news this hour is historic. The vote is comprehensively no. Australia will not be changing to a republic. A clear majority against the question and comfortably in a majority of states. And while counting is still continuing, only Victoria appears to be close. At this hour, only 10,000 votes separates yes from no in that state, but around the country a substantially different story. Here in New South Wales, trending towards 54% against. Opposition is strongest in Queensland. More than 60% will say no in this referendum. Voters in Western Australia, Tasmania and South Australia all comfortably against the Republic change. Nationally, we're approaching 55% of people voting no. So the test for a referendum question fails. Ironically, this is almost exactly opposite of what many newspaper polls had been projecting. Even this morning, the Australian newspaper and the Sydney Morning Herald had tipped a double win for yes. Both were wrong. The reaction from constitutional monarchists here has been rightly celebrations. They won this argument against an onslaught from the Republic camp involving celebrities and marketing campaigns. But on this historic night, the status quo remains. The Constitution will not change. Our system of government will not be overhauled. The public has spoken, and they like what they already had. Reporting live from the Tally Room, Jason Morrison, Macquarie National News.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for reminding us of that wonderful night. I remember I was asked to go to the Opera House, where the Republicans were to celebrate the day or the evening in front of the Opera House with drinks and tables overloaded with food. And Jason Lee was there representing the Republicans. The BBC asked me, they said, well, the BBC asked me, Jason Yat-sen Lee, who's an MP in the state parliament, the BBC asked me, well, how are things going? I'd done some back-of-the-envelope calculations, and I said, it looks like a landslide, no vote. And Jason Lee did the biggest double take I've ever seen, and that's how it turned out. Victoria went our way. In terms of electorates, 72% of electorates voted no. If this had been an election, that would have been an extraordinary landslide. It was a wonderful victory. There's just one final question I want to ask this panel, because they won't be assembling together to discuss this again for some time. And I did ask Tony Abbott this, and all of this, more detail about this, will be on ADH TV and on our YouTube channel. But I asked Tony Abbott, I said, well, obviously, if you're doing one thing, if the politicians are doing one thing, it means they won't be doing another constitutional issue. And are there really more important questions or really important questions that they should be looking at. I said to Tony, is there one that you would think of? And he said, yes, there's one. It's federation. It's dysfunctional. It's a dysfunctional dog's breakfast. I shall ask the panel now, is there any constitutional issue which should have been looked at, which wasn't looked at, because not only were 10 years spread initially on the Republic, then there were 25 years where there was always regularly a vacuous threat of a second referendum, which they were never game to put. The panel, Mr. Howard, anything we should have been discussing?
Look, I disagree with my dear friend Tony on this. I think our federation has got a lot of flaws, but all federations are dysfunctional. And if you think the Australian Federation is dysfunctional, go to Canada. Or go to India. Go to Nigeria. The truth is that we are the product of a coming together by political trade-offs. It is ridiculous that a House of Representatives seat in Tasmania is represented by, 40 or 50,000 people, whereas in New South Wales it's a lot more. But they're the sort of trade-offs you have. I mean, if I could wave a magic wand and alter the Constitution in one respect that's relevant to the operation of our current system, I would remove the ridiculous requirement that says that if a bill is rejected twice in the Senate, you've got to have a double dissolution. I think if a bill is rejected once in a Senate and is rejected again, you can then have a joint sitting without having to have an intervening intervening election for both houses of Parliament. And in case anybody thinks that would have given enormous power to governments over the last few years, it would have enabled our government, my government, to have gone past legislation without having to have a double dissolution, and it would at the beginning of the Rudd government, but not the end of the Rudd government, and on no other occasion since 1996. And I just think that's a silly provision. But at the end of the day, that's a minor tidying up. I think our system works well. We're lucky. It's representative. It does treat the smaller states well. I know on occasions the bargaining in the on revenue can be tough. I remember the late Bill Wentworth, who had a wonderful turn of phrase, and he called the Loan Council that sort of used to divide up the national cake, he called it the Small States Plunder Association with his colourful term. I think if you live in Western Australia, you'd be pretty happy with the existing arrangement. It's pretty good. But do I think it's going to get changed? No. I didn't agree with Paul Keating very often, but one thing he said that made a lot of sense to me is never get between a state premier and a bag of money.
Do any other members of the panel wish to speak?
I was somebody who spent nearly 10 years in the state cabinet, and I think that states should be dumbed down. I think they should be stripped of some of their powers. But my view is when we've got zero unemployment, when there are no Aboriginal kids living in poverty, when there are no women getting bashed by their husbands, when there are no schools looking for resources, when every hospital is being treated the same as a first world hospital, then let's have a look at constitutional reform. Because until all those issues are dealt with, Australians just don't give it. Great phrase. They don't. So, but I would like to see, I mean, I sat in cabinet and there was some issues there that I remember thinking to myself, why is the state government interested in this? Because the Commonwealth should be looking after it. So there are certainly some, 120 years after the Australia Act was passed through the House of Commons, Are there amendments that should be made? Yeah, there should be. But we're not going to get it through, and we saw it time and time again, whether it be the voice referendum or the Republic referendum, it's not going to come through while there's a kid that's hungry, while the woman that's vulnerable.
Thank you. I preface my remarks by saying, I sit here as one of many in this room, committed, diligent, campaigners on the referendum, and I was under the instruction of Kerry Jones. I was working with the late Dr. Amy McGrath, and we were really David's foot soldiers, that we were ringing every electorate and we were saying, how's it going, the campaign, what resources have you got? Then we'd be signalling to volunteers on the back room, and many, very retirees in the senior years, but very committed to this. And that was the operation, so it's been an absolute privilege to join here. But as the newest member of the New South Wales Parliament on the issue of the Constitution, I guess I'd probably just reflect by saying we have a bit of fun in opposition in terms of the government's excuse. This is the state Labor government's excuse in terms of funding. And so we've got and while it's sort of not constitutional, but just in terms of the federal-state relations, we get all the state Labor premiers getting to Canberra, nodding their heads, signing up to these housing targets, to these quotas, and the New South Wales Premier nods his head, signs on the dotted line, Albo, good on you, mate, you've made a big commitment here for the state. And then all of a sudden, we hear the premiers, great job done, we've got the housing targets, we're going to deliver this for New South Wales. Then they walk out the door and then they say, hang on a moment, whoops, we didn't really ask for any infrastructure funding. So I guess from the Commonwealth-state relation, from an opposition perspective, it doesn't add up, it doesn't stack up, and we're going to continue to prosecute this. But in terms of the community, I think they'd say, well, what's all this about? We've voted, we've had our say, we want the confidence in the Australia, the system we know today. Yeah.
Look, David, I agree with Prime Minister Howard. I don't have a problem with the Federation, but I do have a real problem with the structure under which it currently operates. For example, Tasmania has a population of 505,000 people. You've got to say this slowly, 505,000 people. It has 12 senators in Canberra. It has 5 members of the House of Representatives. In the lower house of the Tasmanian Parliament, it has 35 members. In the upper house of the Tasmanian Parliament, it has 15 members. And it has 27 local government authorities. Now, if someone imagines that that is the way we ought to function, or alternatively, that is how we can afford to operate a federation in this country, then they're off their heads. I was in Canberra last weekend, and I thought, well, I'll just go drive, because it's a while since I've been there, and I'll drive around. Canberra also has a population of 502,000 people. And I see a great big sign, the Law Courts of the ACT, the Legislative Assembly of the ACT, the Ministry of Sport of the ACT, the Treasury of the ACT. Are you kidding me? I mean, what kind of country can afford this kind of excess and extravagance? We are the most overrepresented country in the world in terms of political representation, and we just can't afford this sort of stuff. So I'm all for the federation, but it's just got completely out of hand. Bob Hawke once said to me, the worst thing I ever did, Alan, was to increase the Senate to 12. God, I said, that's not the worst thing you've ever done, Bob, but I sort of don't agree with that anyway, but this is where we are. How can this country go on affording this structure under the guise of federation? Now, everyone's whinging about Lydia Thorpe and her performance when the King and Queen were here, which was atrocious, it was vulgar, it was unacceptable. However, how does Lydia Thorpe get there? On a preferential voting system. That's how she's there, as a result of preferences. She got 109 votes when the last election, and the preferences just flow to her, and she's suddenly stuck there. Do we believe this is the best system of determining who represents us? Now, England have a different system, but I'm afraid I can't. They talked in Queensland, the Liberal Party now, to their great sense, have put the Greens last and will preference Labor ahead of the Greens, and McGrath has challenged the Labor Party to do likewise. Will they? I mean, everyone says, oh, well, they won't vote for Albo. Albo's gone, the Labor Party's gone, can't get the votes to the next election. Albo doesn't have to worry about getting the votes. If they don't vote Labor, they'll vote Greens. And the Greens' preferences votes swing straight to the Labor Party. If it was a first past the post outfit, the Liberal Party are there every time. So, I mean, we've got to think system.
Wouldn't have won in 1961.
Yes, that's right. On the communist preferences. on communist preferences in 61. We won in 61 on communist preferences to Jim Killen. But all I'm saying, John, is I think these things need to be debated. I mean, there's an awful extravagance. I mean, when I worked for a Prime Minister, we had 5 staff. The current Prime Minister has over 60 staff. Can anyone justify this sort of stuff? The Lord Mayor of Sydney has 12 media people. I mean, this is over the top. And so to some extent, the taxpayer is being robbed. And I think those are aspects, not federation, those are aspects of the system that need to be reviewed.
Ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, may I thank John Howard, David Elliott, Rachel Merton, Alan Jones, John Olson, Jason Morrison, and Daniel LaHood. And may I say 2 things. Firstly, advance Australia Fair, and God save the Queen. I meant the King. Always living in the past.